Good morning, guys. Now, the question I'm going to pose to you this morning is a question that has confused and divided people for centuries in England. Are you a cat person or a dog person? People have argued, fought, disagreed, and gone to horrible deeds and lengths to enforce their opinion on this question. In fact, I think you can actually trace back one of those bloody and brutal events in Reading's history, the siege of Reading, to this question. In fact, I think you can trace one of England's most brutal events, this English Civil War, back down to this very question: dogs or cats? Now, you might think that's stupid, but one of our key individuals today was most definitely a cat person. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, and he went to school in this building right here behind me. And he was most definitely a cat person. And why did that help start the English Civil War? Well, if there's one thing English people love, or many English people love, it's dogs. And in the 17th century, you could go to church and you were more than welcome to bring your dog to church. Nowadays, if you go to church, that might be slightly frowned upon. And one of the reasons for this is because of William Laud. He loved cats. He had a pet cat, lots of pet cats himself. He had a giant pet tortoise. Don't know why he had one of those. He just did. He must have loved tortoises, I guess. But he, as part of his reforms to the Church of England, decided to ban dogs from churches. Now, I know I can hear the shouts coming through the video now. A load of dog lovers are screaming with rage and thinking, what? Why am I not allowed to take Fido or Lassie into church with me when I'm praying to God? Well, William Laud thought that was wrong. He banned your dog from church. And ever since, dogs are not really allowed in English churches during worship. And it was this that led to the English Civil War, this disagreement between cat lovers like William Laud and dog lovers like everyone else, that started the English Civil War and led to the brutal siege of Reading. Now, there's a bit of an interesting thing about British history or English history. The English are always considered quite a conservative group of people by nature, and not really liking much change, and just wanting everything to be kind of quite slow and gradual change of society. We don't really go in for things like, riots and revolutions and things like that, like they do in places like France or Russia or other countries around the world. Now, this is a bit of an undeserved reputation, really, because England had its very own revolution before France, before Russia, and it included a massive change in England as a country and in society as a whole in England. And one of the big causes for that ground-shaking change in English society, the English Revolution that took place in the 17th century, one of the biggest causes of that was right here in Reading, and that cause was a man called Archbishop William Laud. And we're just here today at one of the important sites of Reading, which is Reading School. Here you can see it. It's a bit of a Fort Knox situation here, because it is still a functioning school, not now because it's school holidays. But this is what it looks like, although William Laud didn't go to this building. This is the modern version of the school, which was built in about the 1870s. He went to the older version of the school that's back in Reading, because Reading School has been around for about 1,000 years, a very old school, one of the first schools in England. And Archbishop William Laud is probably one of his most famous former school pupils. And in every revolution, you've got guys at the top, and and you've got people at the bottom, and the people at the bottom are trying to take out the guys at the top. And Archbishop William Laud, he was definitely one of the guys at the top who everyone else, or a lot of other people, were trying to get rid of. So, and he was a key cause of the English Revolution for that reason. So we're going to be looking a little bit of his history here in Reading, to try and have a look at the English Revolution and how it changed society here in Reading, and how actually the English are at times a pretty rebellious lot. So why was there this big disagreement? Well, the disagreement kind of came down to two main things. The first one was religion, and the second one was kind of power and politics. And to be honest, that's a bit simplistic, because really the two things kind of intertwined. They were basically the same thing in those days. You had a kind of spectrum of religion in England at that time. On one extreme end you had the Roman Catholics, which was obviously the ancient, traditional, hierarchical version of Christianity that had been around for 1600 years, or was very hierarchical by that point. Okay, and there weren't many of those people left in England, but where you did have some, they tended to be wealthier members of the aristocracy, people who had followed that religion their whole life and they really agreed with it. And we'll go into more detail about why that was later on. And on the other side of the spectrum, you had people who, since new ideas from Martin Luther, the kind of revolutionary in some ways monk from Germany, kind of some of his ideas, you had the other opposite of Christianity, which was kind of the new ideas of Protestantism and things like that. Now, why is this important? How does it entwine with politics? Well, to a certain extent, the Roman Catholic Church, in its ideas, it was one of incredible hierarchy and very rigid structures. And for example, you could only read the Bible, you could only interact with God's most important document, the Bible, if you were educated, wealthy really, because it was all written in Latin. So only members of the church could interpret it for you. Not only that, if you remember the Roman Catholic Church, you couldn't really have a personal relationship with God. For example, you couldn't really ask him directly for forgiveness. You had to go to confession, and then a priest would give you forgiveness through confession. So it's quite a hierarchical, structured idea of religion. Now the Protestants, they thought completely differently. They thought, no, all that kind of tradition, all that kind of stuff and baggage that the Roman Catholic Church had, we don't need that in our religion. We can read the Bible for ourselves and interpret that and have our own relationship with God. We can have our own relationship with God and try and get him to forgive us if we pray and have a good life and lead a good life. And also all that things like pilgrimage and saints and donations and wealth and the pageantry and the extreme wealth of the church, we don't really need to have that either. Okay, and these two extremes of religion kind of coalesced with some political changes that were going on at the moment. Now, at the same time as you had these big religious changes and ideas going on, that kind of coincided with another big change that was going on all across European society at the same time. Okay, previously you'd had a situation where you had wealthy landowners who had maybe owned land for hundreds of years, and they were the wealthy aristocracy, and they basically lived out their lives owning lots of land and becoming incredibly wealthy in the process of doing that. And that's how it had been for hundreds of years. But because of certain things changing, technology, the economy changing in the early modern period, you had then a growth of a new class of people, a new group of people that were getting very, very wealthy, not as a result of the land they owned, but as a result of other things, such as their ability to trade, to be merchants, to buy and sell things, to lend money to people, or if on the lower end of the scale, just because they had a skilled job like a printer or something like that, that gave them just that little bit of education, that's that little bit of ability to earn a little bit of money and educate themselves as well. And this kind of new class, this new group of people, because they didn't own any land, they didn't have lordships and titles and knighthoods like the landed aristocracy did, they were considered pretty low by the aristocracy. They weren't given any political rights and things like that, and yet they were getting more and more wealthy. So this group of people decided, right, actually, we want a piece of the action too. We want some influence and political power too, and we want to be part of the action. Now that rich group of people, the landed aristocracy, who had always run things and always had land, they tended to tend more towards the Roman Catholic side of things. They loved all the power structures, things like that, that made it very clear who was high up in society and who was low down. And so they tended to support the Roman Catholic ideas, or some direct the Roman Catholic Church, or just a watered down version of it in England. Whereas the new group of people, the kind of educated merchants and skilled people, and people who are traders or bankers or things like that, people who basically made money through their own kind of skill and intelligence and sometimes hard work, or sometimes trickery or what have you. Those group of people tended, not always obviously, they tended to agree more with the Protestant ideas, because they thought, well, I want an individual relationship with God based on who I am and what I can do, not based on hundreds of years of tradition and centuries of archaic structures and power structures in the church. I believe that just like I've succeeded in life, I want to have that personal relationship with God, and I want some of these new ideas, because I'm kind of part of a new idea of earning money myself as well. Now obviously, history is not always that black and white. There were people who were aristocrats who agreed with Protestantism as well, and there were people who were merchants who bought into the Roman Catholic idea. But generally the kind of decline in the power of Catholicism and ideas like that kind of also coincided with people wanting new ideas in political ways as well. So that's why it's really important when we're looking at this stuff today in Reading, in this history of the English Revolution, that we don't say, oh well, that was just a religious disagreement, or that was just a religious thing that they were angry about. Okay, because religion and politics at this time were basically the same thing. If you were Roman Catholic, you tended to support the old order and how things had always been. Okay, or if you were a slightly watered down Laudian version of that, you tended to support the old order. If you were a Protestant, you tended to support the new order, how you wanted things to be different. You wanted a newer or different society where people had a more equal chance. So here we are at one of the other important sites of one of the causes of the Siege of Reading, the former site of Reading School. It's now Reading Old Town Hall, lovely little concert venue there, and Reading Museum, important location because it's where I had my Reading reception, partly because it's close to the church, St James's Church, that we saw in the Abbey video, but also because it was great for the wedding guests, because they could have a party inside there where the reception was, and if they found their drinks too expensive, they could always come here to this cheap pub and get themselves an extra refreshment there. But we're not actually going to have a look at this building too much here, because whilst it's the site of Reading School, founded by the Abbey, there's the Abbey again, this building isn't actually part of the Reading School of the time. This is a new building that was built later on. So we're going to have a little look and see if we can find where the last few remaining parts of the building of Reading School are. And I think it's just down here. Now you might remember St Lawrence's Church from earlier on in the series. And if we just go down here, down this little alleyway, good morning pigeons, how are we? Then we'll be able to find, I believe, the last remaining buildings of Reading School, because this is an important location, because this is where William Laud, perhaps one of the most important individuals for English history to come out of Reading, came from. Yeah, here we go, we can find it over here now. William Laud went to school in Reading. He was from this area originally, and he rose through the church to being the Archbishop of Canterbury. And you can see here, this old building here is all that really remains of Reading School as it was in the days of Archbishop William Laud. Now, why is Archbishop William Laud so important for our history today? Well, he's in a way from Reading, but also one of the key causes of the siege of Reading and the English Civil War. Archbishop William Laud, he wasn't a Catholic, but the problem that many English people had with him was that they thought he was a Catholic. The Reformation had changed many things. It changed the way people worshipped, it changed the way people experienced church, and this was very important for people at the time, as you might remember, because people thought, well, if we get it wrong, if we get how we worship wrong, we're going to hell. So it wasn't just, something where people thought, well, you have this preference, we have this preference, let's agree to differ. People just didn't see it like that in those days, because they thought, well, if we get it wrong, if I'm worshipping the wrong way, then I'm going to hell, and that's a real problem for me. Well, William Laud thought that many of the old parts of the Catholic worship in churches should come back. He agreed that churches should have gold in, they should have wealthy ornaments to them. He also believed that bishops should be an important part and quite a powerful part of the church and have a lot of say in how the church was wrong and how ordinary people should live their lives. And many people, particularly very strict Protestants, Puritans at the time, really disagreed with William Laud. The other thing with William Laud is that he wasn't really very good at coming to compromises. He really was a kind of like a stickler for the rules and stickler for people doing even the real detail of what he wanted, and so he rubbed up a lot of people the wrong way for that reason as well. He was unmarried, which was unusual for a man of his time because he was Protestant, so he was allowed to get married. He was quite a powerful man, and many people did. Now that may be that perhaps secretly he did agree with the Roman Catholic way of bishops and monks and priests not getting married and things like that, but actually there's also a suggestion that he might have been gay as well. Certainly some of the letters he wrote to some of his friends at the time suggest that, and also in his personal diaries he wrote about how he would have dreams about personal friends of his visiting him in his bed at night. So it's quite likely that William Laud was also gay, which suggests perhaps that's another reason why some people, there was homophobia at the time, perhaps some people suspected that and didn't like him for that reason as well. Or perhaps they associated his lack of marriage with the fact that he might really be a Roman Catholic who didn't agree with monks and bishops and priests marrying. So yeah, William Laud, he was the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, and he went to school here in Reading, and it wasn't just that he had these ideas about religion, but it's also in how he helped enact them. Because it's one thing to have very strong beliefs about your own religion and how things should be done, but William Laud was very keen that everyone in England should do the same as him, and he was willing to use very, very harsh punishments and use something called the Star Court to enact those punishments on people if they weren't doing what he wanted them to do. For example, another group of Protestants in England at the time, Puritans, they wanted to worship in a slightly different way. They wanted to not have any bishops in the Church of England. They wanted everyone to have their own kind of freedom and a way of worshipping their own way, and William Laud just wasn't okay with that. In fact, Puritans could quite often have their ears sliced off and cut off. They could be brutally whipped. They could be forced to hang from a tree by one arm for several hours, and there were lots of harsh punishments that would be enacted on these Puritans by William Laud, by the Star Court, and by the King of England at the time, that made people really, really angry. And so religion was a big cause of this siege of Reading and the English Civil War, and particularly William Laud and his ideas about religion and his belief that the Catholic way, or some of the ways of Catholic worship, weren't that bad and that they should be kept in England. Okay, so William Laud, slightly believing in some Catholic traditions, Puritans hating those traditions, and that big disagreement and his harsh enforcing of that, his own idea of the Protestant tradition, was one of the big causes of the English Civil War and the siege of Reading. So here we are in Market Place. Now this is one of the important locations for the start of the Civil War, or one of the causes for the start of the Civil War and the siege in Reading. Now what's Market Place used for? Well, it's a market. Okay, back in the 17th century, this would be a place where people would come to buy and sell their goods and make money. Nowadays, the market isn't used so much for that kind of thing, although on a Friday there is a street food market where people buy, I would say, slightly overpriced food from, to be fair, all around the world on their office lunchtime breaks. But in the 17th century, in 1633, this was a scene of a much more brutal event, because what happened in 1633 was a man called Ludovic Boyer was punished very, very harshly for something that you might not consider such a terrible crime. In our youth, all of us have been guilty of perhaps going to a public house, having too many beers, and perhaps claiming things that were not 100% true. I myself have claimed to be fourth in line to the kingdom, the throne of Prussia. Some people have also claimed or accused me, whilst they've had too many things to drink, of looking a little bit like a Nigel Farage. But what we see here, what we saw here in 1633, was a man being punished very harshly for much the same thing. This man, Ludovic Boyer, was put on the stocks here for an accusation of libel. Now, what does that mean, being put on the stocks? Well, it's a pretty awful punishment. Firstly, you would have your head and your hands put through a wooden frame. Your ears would then be nailed to the wooden frame behind you so that you couldn't turn your face left or right. Now, the reason they wanted you to be unable to turn your face left and right was so that when people threw things at you, if you're lucky, rotten vegetable; if you're unlucky, rocks, stones, bricks, you couldn't turn your eyes and your face away from them. So people went blind being put in the stocks. It was a terrible thing. It was a form of public punishment, and it could send people blind. It was horrible. Not only that, but he was forced to pay a £3,000 fine for this libel. That's about £250,000, £250,000 in today's money. He was also ordered to be branded with either an R or an L on each cheek, where a red, white hot metal R or L would be forced and burnt, permanently scarring him into his cheek. R for rogue, L for liar. And he was also to be put in prison for life. Now, what did Ludovic do to receive this awful, scarring, but possibly blinding and lifelong punishment? Well, all he said was that the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, was a Roman Catholic, and that he'd been sending money to the Pope every year. Now, why was this such a problem for the people of England? Well, firstly, at the time, for various reasons we've already discussed, many people hated Roman Catholicism and hated the Pope. But what really made people angry about and helped cause the Civil War and the siege of Reading was this harsh punishment for such a small crime. Just maybe telling some long stories, some, a little lie here and there. And the reason this harsh punishment was able to be enacted was something called the Star Courts. Now, the Star Courts were basically a license for Charles I, the King of England at the time, to punish anyone really easily. They were originally set up to help the monarchy punish rich landowners who wouldn't be successfully found guilty in other courts. But under Charles I, these Star Chamber Courts, this Star Chamber Court was used basically as a replacement parliament, denying people or the rich men of England the right to be represented in a parliament. And it also allowed the king to basically take anyone he wanted and give them the harshest punishments and find them guilty of the harshest of the worst crimes or the not so bad crimes, and punish them with the harshest punishments. So this was seen as very unjust. This was seen as a real affront to the freedom and liberty of ordinary people. And so the use of the Star Courts and harsh punishments enacted on people like Ludovic right here in Marketplace for bragging, drinking too much, and telling people that Archbishop William Laud was a Catholic. Just by saying that drunkenly in a pub, you could end up in prison for life, hugely in debt, with a permanent scarring on both cheeks, possibly blind, and also whipped for the punishment as well. So these punishments, like we saw here in Marketplace in 1633, were one of the big causes, these harsh punishments by the Star Courts, one of the big causes of the Civil War, the English Civil War, and the Siege of Reading. Okay, so I may have slightly exaggerated the impact of cats and dogs on the causes of the Civil War, but who knows? English people really love their dogs. I mean, they really do. Have you ever tried setting off fireworks in your back garden on bonfire night? English people are crazy about dogs.